And we're incredibly excited to bring Justin Hall here. Justin is Associate Professor of Comics at the California College of the Arts and a Fulbright Scholar. He's a pioneer historian of LGBTQ comics, curating major shows at the SF Cartoon Art Museum. He is the creator of the comic book series True Travel Tales, Hard to Swallow with Dave Davenport, and Glamazonia. He is the editor of No Straight Lines, 4 Decades of Queer Comics, a massive collection of LGBT comics published by Fantagraphics Books, which won a Lambda Literary Award and received an Eisner nomination, and is now being made into a feature-length documentary film, which we'll get to see a sneak peek here today. And without further ado, please give a round of applause to Justin Hall here.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for being here, and I really appreciate it. And thank you to Kai and Eric and everyone else at Berkeley City College. This is an amazing, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. I've never talked about research before. This is kind of a new idea for me. So I figured that I would break it into 2 different sections. One, kind of the research process that I had doing the No Straight Lines book, kind of looking through 4 decades of LGBTQ comics, and chronicling that history. And then the second half would just be some of my own process. Right now I'm making a graphic novel that has some historically based sections of it. So I can kind of talk a little bit about that. So please, questions about any of this are absolutely welcome. Who here actually makes comics? Awesome. Okay. And who here is actually interested in research, like the history of comics and researching comics and kind of the academic world around comics? Yeah, excellent. It's a really exciting moment right now because comics have always been, looked down upon for so long. There was a time when libraries were not friendly to comics, and luckily that's not true anymore. Librarians are our greatest allies at this point, I think, and it's really exciting to watch comics come into the academic world and be accepted, and all these new opportunities existing for cartoonists and for comic scholars. So I'm very excited about all of that. And this book is definitely part of that. I created No Straight Lines, 4 Decades of Queer Comics in 2012. It took me about 3 years of research to do this work. And just to give you kind of a basic rundown of the material itself, I basically start off, there was material, queer comics material before the Stonewall riots that kind of birthed a lot of the kind of modern queer rights movement. Not to say that there wasn't stuff happening before that, obviously there was, but a lot of the, what ended up happening around Stonewall was that this time period was that there was this birth of queer newspapers and magazines, and they needed comics material. So here's a kind of lovely little, see if this actually works. Let's see if this actually comes through. This was actually a video game created by Eric Orner, who is a wonderful cartoonist. He created the Mostly Unfabulous Social Life of Ethan Green, and he created this in 2008 as a little homage to Stonewall. So as I said, Stonewall really this time period ended up birthing a new. There we go. A need for queer gag strips, basically. So this is one from Joe Johnson, Miss Thang, about 1969, well, it's leather, isn't it? So it's kind of taking 2 gay icons, the kind of leather dude and the queen, and kind of putting them up next to each other. Here's another one from a little bit later by Charles Ortlieb and Richard Sciala, Christopher Street, Why Most Gay Crimes Go Unsolved. You can still see the clones in the caster today. So now the other major event that happens that contributes to the history of queer comics is the birth of the underground comics movement. And that's comics with an X, C-O-M-I-X. San Francisco Bay Area ended up being a huge epicenter of that movement. The initial stuff, probably the most famous cartoonist to come out of that movement is Robert Crumb. But there was a wide range of folks coming out of that. And of course, the majority of them were straight guys, basically. And a lot of the material ended up being quite misogynistic and at times homophobic. So, but luckily there were people resisting that. And we have this, It Ain't Me Babe comics, comes out in 1970. It's produced by Last Gasp Comics, but it's actually it ends up being a pamphlet that's put into It Ain't Me Babe, which was a Berkeley-based feminist newspaper, underground feminist newspaper in the 70s. And it's the first time that there's a collection of all women cartoonists. It's the first time that's ever happened. Trina Robbins is the editor of that. She still lives in San Francisco. She's an amazing, amazing character. You should absolutely go to see her whenever she comes to speak, because she's incredible. It's enough of a success, and they realized that there's enough of a kind of need for women's voices in the underground comics movement, that she joins with a bunch of other women cartoonists, and 2 years later comes out with a women's comics collective. So these people like Lea Mars, Aline Kaminsky-Crumb, Dory Sita, a lot of Roberta Gregory, a lot of really important cartoonists come out of this anthology series, cut their teeth on it and come out of it. It's wonderful to kind of hear the stories from this time period, and listening to Lea Mars talk about everyone getting together and smoking a lot of pot, drinking a lot of red wine, and kind of coming up with all their comic ideas. But this comes out in 1972, published by Last Gasp, which is still in existence in San Francisco. It's a publisher and distributor in San Francisco. Within the pages of Women's Comics #1 is this story by Trina Robbins. It's called Sandy Comes Out. And I call this the first kind of what I would call literary queer comics. And by literary queer comics, I mean comics that are not erotic or derogatory. Because certainly there were comics that had kind of derogatory depictions of queer people before that. And there was also a backlog of really wonderful work created by Tom Finland and other mostly gay male cartoonists. That stuff is incredibly important. Oddly enough, it's better archived than the literary stuff because of groups like the Tom Finland Foundation, the Center of Sex and Culture. So when I set out to do this book, I wanted to actually shine a spotlight and document the literary work because it was more in danger of being lost, of being forgotten, which is odd because usually erotica is the stuff that ends up getting kind of tossed away and forgotten about. But in this particular instance, it was kind of the reverse. So I would call this the first essentially literary queer comic. It's a 3-page comic, and it's actually about Robert Crumb's sister. So Sandy Crumb leaves her husband with her baby, moves out to San Francisco, and moves in with Robert and his wife at the time. And immediately he tries to kind of start passing her off to his greasy cartoonist buddies, which is a problem. And so Trina Robbins hears what's happening, and she comes swooping in and says, "Why don't you come live with me as my roommate?" So she does, and then about a year later, she ends up coming out as a lesbian and moving into a gay hippie commune in Haight-Ashbury, which is what you did in 1973, or 72. And Trina decides to write a story about it, right? And she actually is helped by Sandy doing this. It's a really fascinating story that most people didn't know about because Sandy was actually, there was a major documentary done on Crumb called Crumb. Has anyone seen that documentary? It's a really wonderful piece. But the sisters, Robert Crumb's sisters, did not want to be in the film. So in a sense, most people kind of don't realize that there's a whole other side of his family. And that Sandy Crumb herself is actually a really important player in the formation of queer comics and feminist comics. A few years back, in 2011, I did a queer comics project class at California College of the Arts. And we brought in different queer cartoonists, pioneering queer cartoonists, and interviewed them, actually, and filmed that. So here's from that series, a film with Trina Robbins discussing the creation of Sandy Comes Out.
My story is the first story about a lesbian in comics. Sandy Comes Out. It's a true story. It was about my roommate, my ex-roommate, Sandy. and it's her story, and we worked on it together, really. I think some of the things and words in the speech balloons were things that she had made up. Even the very ending, when I said, how shall I end this? She decided what I should be saying in that speech balloon. And in the first speech balloon where she's looking in the mirror and talking, she made that up too. And yet, I have been told by Mary Wings and Roberta Gregory, both of whom produced, I think it's a kind of neck and neck, produced the first lesbian comic book, that it was my comic that inspired them because they were so angry, so outraged that a straight woman, and obviously a straight woman should be doing a comic about a lesbian. But you should know, of course, that Mary and Roberta and I are best friends now. That's over. But it's just, to me, it's very important that, okay, I was a straight woman doing a comic about a lesbian, but nobody else was doing a comic about a lesbian. So what, I'm supposed to sit around and wait for a lesbian to do it?
So Trina is quite a force of nature. And she does end up doing this comic that ends up inspiring, in fact, people like Mary Wings and Roberta Gregory to do their own comics. So Mary Wings also lives in San Francisco, and we've interviewed her as well, both for the upcoming documentary film and also for this comics project. And she talks about how she felt like there was an emotional component to the coming out story that was lost in Trina's depiction of it. And so she created Come Out Comics in 1973 in the basement of a radical women's karate cooperative in Oregon, and sold it through mail order for $1. Eventually, it was picked up by Last Gasp, the same publisher of women's comics, and It Aint Me Babe comics, and it was distributed nationally. It's honestly terrible. I mean, it's a really terrible comic. It's very rough, but it's incredibly earnest, and it's really beautiful in its earnestness, and it's pure kind of honesty and emotional impact. So Mary ends up becoming better as a cartoonist over the course of the next number of years, contributes to the women's comics anthology, to the gay comics anthology series, and then eventually ends up leaving comics and going to produce the first lesbian detective novels. That's actually what she's most known for, is the lesbian detective novels. But she really, talking to her is really quite remarkable because getting a sense of historical perspective on this, she had never heard the word lesbian until she was 19, right? And that's such an incredibly profound generational difference, I feel like, where, literally she didn't have a word for what she was experiencing and thought she was the only person in the world experiencing this. And that absolutely profoundly affected who she is as a creator, because she has a mission. She wants to make sure that that doesn't happen to anyone else again. And you see that now there's something really remarkable about comics as a DIY, do-it-yourself kind of art form, where people can tell their own stories and get it out there and try to create these connections and communications. And make sure that people are not just living in ignorance. You see that later on with trans cartoonists and non-binary cartoonists. I mean, it's a really important kind of project. Here's an image of Mary Wings from our film. She's amazing. She lives in San Francisco. She bought a home in Bernal Heights while San Francisco was cheap back in the 70s. And she lives in the basement of this building, and it's we went to film her, and she's like rolling joints out of the pot she grows in her backyard, and then whips out her accordion, and she plays an accordion, and she's got these two terriers that kind of follow along and start like singing along with her so she's incredible on film, right? I mean, the wonderful thing about doing this documentary is that not only am I passionate about the work itself, I think it's a really important cultural movement and cultural moment, but also the people who created this work are really quite interesting, fascinating people to be on screen. So that certainly helps, especially with a documentary film. This is Dynamite Damsels, which was the other comic that Trina was referring to in that other clip. This is created by Roberta Gregory in 1976. So it's actually a few years later than Mary's production. But it's the first continuing series created by a woman cartoonist or a queer person, a queer cartoonist that's not erotic. And Roberta Gregory is actually a comics prodigy. She goes on to create naughty bits for Fantagraphics. She's done a lot of work over the years. She's quite a remarkable cartoonist and still making great work. Yeah, I love this piece here. You know, is the women's movement really a lesbian plot? Well, yeah. Another person who I will mention, because I believe she taught here, right? Lea Mars. Did Lea Mars teach in Berkeley City College? Oh, okay, maybe I might be getting this wrong. Oh, she did. Okay, she like ran the multimedia department, right? Is that? Yeah, yeah. Lea Mars is amazing. Like, I want to be here when I grow up. She's freaking amazing. So she was a pioneer underground cartoonist during this underground comics movement. She was one of the founding mamas of women's comics. She created the further fattening adventures of Pudge Girl Blimp in 1975. And this is the first openly bisexual character in comics. It's amazing. And then she also went on to do work in the mainstream comics world, do film as well, multimedia art. She's astounding. She also created a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles spin-off called Gangrene Geriatric Gerbils, I think it was. So you can tease her about that one. Skipping over some stuff here, I'm not going into like all the nitty-gritty, but basically what ends up happening is that Dennis Kitchen, who's one of the founder of Kitchen Sink Press, which was one of the major underground comics publishers, realizes that there's stuff happening here, like that there's so much depth to, and passion behind the queer women's work, and there's also all this stuff that's happening in kind of gay male erotic work, queer male erotic work, that there's call for an underground comics anthology series that will kind of bring all this stuff together. So he's a cisgender straight guy, knows that he can't edit it himself, but he goes to his friend Howard Cruz, who was a prominent underground cartoonist at the time. He was not out because almost nobody was during that time period, and basically says, look, it's time for you to person up and to actually edit this, come out and edit this anthology series and do this, right? Howard was scared about losing his livelihood because he was doing a lot of illustration work even for places like Playboy. So he was a little bit scared about what his career, how this would affect his career. But he decided to take it on. He said that there was this moment where he and Dennis, they put together a call for submissions, and they did mimeographs or whatever it was, and then put it into the mailbox, and he kind of hugged the mailbox afterwards. You realize he couldn't take it back. There's a kind of moment when you drop it in the mailbox and you can't like go digging for it anymore. But it paid off, right? So he ended up getting a huge, a groundswell of support from the comics community. Now, mind you, there were people that pushed back, right? Because at that time, nobody knew who was queer in the closeted comics community, in the closeted world at the time. And so they basically sent it to everybody that they knew. And some cartoonists did write back saying, well, what is this about? Like, why are you sending this to me, right? But enough people did, of course, respond positively. And he got all the support from the queer women's movement that was happening already. So Trina Robbins and Mary Wings and Roberta Gregory and Lea Mars, they all contributed. But then also kind of a new batch of queer men also joined up with this. This is actually, the cover art is done by Randy Holmes, who's a Canadian artist. I was just talking actually with Hilary Chute, who's a big comics theorist and academic, and she was trying to find Randy Holmes. He's now deceased, but his wife has the rights to this work, and was trying to find it in order to reproduce it in her book. And it's a really hard thing to do. She finally was able to track this person down and get the permission. But it's something to think about when you're doing academic work around this kind of material, that a lot of it's hard to find. A lot of people have passed away. It's hard to figure out where the rights happen. I ran into this a bunch of times in the creation of No Straight Line. So it does bring up kind of ethical and legal concerns. There's one lesbian cartoonist, Natalie, I'm blanking on her last name right now, but I really loved her work and I wanted to include it, and I couldn't find her. And I had Alison Bechdel and Jennifer Camper and everybody trying to find her. All we knew is that she had become a nurse and kind of dropped out of comics. And I ended up running it. I was like, I think she'll be okay with this. And we did run into her. We eventually did find her, and she was fine with it. And I gave her a copy of the book and thanked her profusely at that moment. But it is taking a risk, right? You can never be quite sure. So this is, when we went to Howard Cruz's home in Western Massachusetts to film with him. Howard Cruz is really the godfather of queer comics because of his work editing the gay comics anthology series, but also he produced the really seminal series Wendell in the pages of The Advocate. And it was the first time that a comic strip had really explored normal life for queer men. It was really very, very groundbreaking work. And he's also one of the great cartoonists. I mean, his craft is spectacular. He also created Stuck Rubber Baby, which I would argue is one of the great American graphic novels. It came out in 1995, which was a little bit too soon. 11 years later, Fun Home comes out from Alison Bechdel, and that book hits Time Magazine Best Book of the Year, is published by a major publisher, and really kind of hits the public. It becomes a mainstream crossover success. But I think it was too early for Stuck Rubber Baby, unfortunately. Got a lot of critical success, but not a lot of sales. He also, he was published by DC Comics, which is quite interesting. He had come to them with this idea of an almost memoir. So when he grew up in Alabama and was coming out during the civil rights movement. And that shows up in Stuck Rubber Baby, which is the main character is a gay white man, a closeted gay white man who is trying to come out in the midst of the civil rights era. And so the book is a very complex intersection of issues around sexuality, gender, race, and and also kind of regional concerns of the South at the time. A lot of politics, but it's beautifully constructed. But he had a child by an accident, essentially, with his girlfriend as he was kind of struggling to come out, and she gave up the baby for adoption. And this child then found Howard, 30 years later, and ended up having a meeting with him, and that was such a kind of profound, emotional story that a cousin of the family ended up writing a prose novel about it. But then the child said to Howard, you need to make it needs to be your voice. You need to make the graphic novel of this story. So he went to DC Comics, which had an imprint at the time called Piranha Press, which did more experimental work. And the editor-in-chief of Piranha Press said, okay, you can do this, and gave him an advance of 2 years worth of advance, basically. So Howard figured that would be enough time. He starts making his pages, quickly realizes that it takes him 5 days to make each page, because there's these massive pages. He does everything with this like pointillism and cross-hatching style that's really incredibly labor-intensive. Beautiful, but labor-intensive. And so he realizes it's going to take him twice that amount of time. So he maxes out his credit cards, goes into debt. Individual pages of the original art end up being sold to literati in New York at the time. So Tony Kushner buys pages. Other people try to buy pages to keep him kind of afloat while he's making the book, and eventually does come out. But it's a really remarkable story, and it's kind of amazing to in terms of making a film as opposed to the book, right? That we got to go to his kitchen and film him talking with Dennis. This is Dennis' kitchen here, about when they decided to create gay comics. And it's just a kind of wonderful thing to be able to do to get the personal stories. So another nice thing about kind of following up with people as opposed to just the work is that you learn more about them, right? So this is work by Rupert Kennard, Cathartic Comics, and this is 1984, though his work did start earlier, actually in the end of the 70s. And he created the first queer black characters in comics. Brown Bomber is this kind of superhero kid over here, and then he introduces Diva Touche Flambe, who is a reincarnated black vegetarian leftist lesbian educator. So these characters are in my book, and it's an important milestone in comics history. But Rupert himself suffered an automobile accident in 1996 and is wheelchair bound now. So his memoir work that he's coming out with now deals with disability as well. So I wouldn't have known that unless I kind of went to him and asked him about his own experiences making comics. There are, of course, dangers. So I would say this in general, the comics community is small enough, and certainly the queer comics community, and accessible enough that you can go and talk to people directly. And if you're doing scholarly work on this, you're doing research on this kind of community, highly suggest reach out to them and talk to them directly. I mean, most of my sources ended up being just kind of primary sources, like talking to people with themselves. But there are also dangers to that, right? There was a woman, Diana Green, who created the first continuing trans comic called Tranny Towers in 1995. And I kind of knew of the work, but I thought it was just a one-off, and I didn't really get it, right? So it's not in the book, and I later become friends with her and got to know her, and then realized what a kind of oversight that ended up being, because I ended up talking about the trans comics that came out in the beginning of the 2000s, which were from people that I knew, right? So there are dangers about just kind of going with what you know, right, and not doing more research, and I have fallen into those pitfalls. I'll leave you here with an image of Alison Bechdel. It was amazing going to shoot with her as well, because she's very much a recluse. Known her since 2003 or 4 when she came to San Francisco for the Alternative Press Expo, and that was her first. She'd already been making Dykes to Watch Out for over 20 years at that time, but it was her first time in a comics convention, which goes to show you how isolated the queer comics community was from the rest of the comics world. They really existed in kind of parallel universes, right? So queer comics were not sold in comic book stores. They were not sold in mainstream bookstores. They were only sold in queer bookstores, serialized in queer newspapers, published by queer publishers, distributed by queer distributors. It was its own insular media community, right? And it actually enabled, at its height, it actually enabled creators to make a living. Not a great one, but Alison was in enough newspapers nationwide, queer newspapers nationwide, because every city had one. And she could make a living with Dykes to Watch Out For. But her career kind of exemplifies what ends up happening, which is that a lot of this insular media world starts to collapse, right? We see fewer and fewer queer bookstores, publishers, newspapers exist in existence these days. And with that, we lose something. I mean, part of that is good in the sense that this material that was only available there is now available in mainstream bookstores, and it's available online. It's disseminated widely, right? And that's a good thing, with more increasing acceptance of queer realities, queer lives, queer experiences, queer stories. But it also meant that she was losing her livelihood. So when she started making the graphic memoir Fun Home about her relationship with her closeted father, who may or may not have committed suicide, and she thought she was going to have to stop cartooning. She was losing her livelihood. All the newspapers that were carrying her work were folding. And she thought that this graphic novel, which was consuming so much of her time, it took her 7 years to make that book. And she thought she was going to publish it with the same lesbian underground publishers that had published the rest of her stuff, Firebrand Books or one of the other ones. But luckily, the culture had shifted enough at that point where her agent brought it to Houghton Mifflin, which is a major book publisher, and they were able to publish it, and it went mainstream. It became a huge success. She won a MacArthur Genius Grant. The thing got turned into a Tony Award-winning musical, and all of that. So it's interesting to kind of see her career as kind of tracking the progress of queer comics and how they interact with the rest of the comics world and the mainstream community. And some, she's able to make that crossover. Some people will not. Diane DeMoss's Hothead Paisan Homicidal Lesbian Terrorist is never going to go mainstream. It's an amazing comic, but it's never going to go mainstream. It's never going to make that crossover. So this is where I was going to then kind of shift over to my own work and kind of doing research for my own work in terms of making comics. Are there any questions or comments about kind of researching comics from an academic point of view, or kind of if you're going to be writing papers about this, or scholarly work, or doing collections like this, or film, for that matter? Yeah.
I mean, we kind of assume that in this environment that all of our things will be preserved. If we're, as artists and creators, thinking ahead, how should we be making sure that what people are making today is still here in 50 years?
I would say libraries. Libraries are now, I mean, and I'm sure the librarians here could speak better to this than I can, but there are archives now in libraries to preserve this kind of material in a way that there weren't even a decade ago. There's a amazing, the largest comics archive right now is at Ohio State. They have an incredible archive. There's actually been talk about making specifically a queer comics archive, and I've been in talks with some people about this. I curated a show of this work in Berlin, the Schwilles Museum there, and they're potentially interested. So I think there's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of archiving and preserving, but it's not as bad as it used to be. But yeah, get your work in. I mean, if you're making work that you're worried about it getting lost, get it into the archives, zine archives, mini comics, self-published comics. There are archives for this stuff now, which is really wonderful. Also, if you're making more sexually explicit or kind of exploratory stuff, Center of Sex and Culture is in San Francisco, run by Carol Queen, is a wonderful institution, and they have a great library as well. So yeah, thanks. Wow. Any other questions about this kind of research and such? Yeah, I do hope that the kind of scholarly work around this continues to grow. I mean, one of the things that struck me about when making No Straight Lines as a book was I kind of thought, I mean, working queer cartoonists, we all tended to kind of know each other at that time period. The world has expanded out broadly since then, right? Really since the moment that I published the book was 2012, right? And after that, there's been this explosion, absolute explosion of queer comics material, especially on the web. And now I think this book would be impossible in the way that I structured it. Like, you can't really do a comprehensive overview. Like, there's too much material, which is wonderful. And also, you can't know everybody who's making the work, whereas we used to kind of all know each other. On the other hand, when I started really digging, you start realizing all this stuff, as you were saying, some people get lost. I went to Last Gasp, which again was a distributor and publisher in the underground comics movement, and still have their warehouses in San Francisco. And I went to their warehouses and dug through. They have this kind of labyrinth of bookshelves, and with dust and cobwebs all over everything. And you just start digging through these piles, and you find some kind of weird underground feminist, zine publication from the 80s or something, and that hasn't been seen in decades. And that stuff is still oftentimes available if you know where to dig. Yeah.
All these comics seem to be geared towards an adult audience,
Mm.
maybe like an out adult audience.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether your research has turned up content geared towards children.
Yeah.
Or maybe a potentially ally with straight
Yeah.
audience.
Yeah. So.
With LGBTQ content.
Yeah, that stuff in particular. So I would say the kind of early generations of this work absolutely were made for adults, right? Because it was about being visible, and that I think was the primary project. So Alison Bechdel, when she did her collection of Dice to Watch Out for Mifflin, she said in the introduction, I wanted to make lesbians visible, right? So there just hadn't been representation, and there was a hunger for representation, and for visual and narrative representation, right? So comics, the DIY nature of comics enabled that. There recently has been an explosion of material really geared for all ages, audiences, and even kids that include queer, LGBTQ characters and themes. And that's been wonderful to see. But that's actually quite recent. I would say really pretty much after my book came out. I mean, there was some stuff before that. David Kelly did a wonderful series called Stevens Comics as early as the 1990s. And that was being run in independent, kind of alternative and queer newspapers. And so there's some other little kind of ones that pop up here and there, but basically I would say this wave of that kind of material has happened really since my book came out. But there's a lot of great stuff now. Melanie Gilman, who teaches with us at CCA, they just came out with a great collection of a webcomic that they did called As the Crow Flies, which is kind of chronicling a girls' summer camp, but with non-binary characters and trans characters, and it's really quite wonderful. And designed to be read by all ages, I mean, very much so. So we're seeing a lot more of that material come out. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments? Yeah. Yeah. Yes, yes. So we actually, Jennifer Camper, who's one of just a kind of luminary, she began her work in the pages of the Gay Comics Anthology series and women's comics, and she was a big player in the kind of dyke punk stuff that happened in the 90s and the aughts. She created the Queers in Comics Conference in New York City in 2015, and that was amazing. There had been a queer comics convention before called BentCon in Anaheim. It kind of ran its course over the course of about 4 years, never quite got self-sufficient, and Sean Z was the guy behind that. But so Jennifer came out with this, and I went to it, kind of expecting it just to be another convention experience. And anyone who's a cartoonist, you do a lot of conventions, and after a while, they get really kind of you've seen a lot of them at a certain point. But I kind of blew me away when I went for the first time to this conference, because it was an academic conference. It wasn't a selling convention. So it was all panels, and there was no tabling. And that really transformed the environment. And I was on the verge of tears the entire time. I was just like, I mean, because you want validation for your weirdo work that you do. At some point you're like, oh right, I just spent decades on this kind of weird underground stuff that, does anybody really care? And then you go to a conference where people care, like they care. And the sense of community was just mind-blowing. So yes, and then we brought it to San Francisco. She cornered me at one point during this conference, and she said, okay, in 2 years, we're gonna bring it out to San Francisco, you're gonna host it at CCA, you're gonna organize it with me. And she's one of those dykes you do not say no to. So I was like, yes, ma'am. So yeah, we did it last year at CCA, and it was really, really fun. So we're gonna do it again in New York in 2 years. It's gonna be biannual, bi-coastal. Yeah, and then there's another place I would say to look for is FlameCon, which is a new queer comics convention that happens in Brooklyn in August, and it's annual. I went to the one last year. It was amazing. And it's not a conference in the same way, so it doesn't have that same kind of idea of academic engagement and kind of cartoonists talking to each other. It's not that. There is tabling, so you're selling your work. But the vibe there was incredible. Like really, really supportive, incredibly diverse. I was worried that it was all going to be fan art of Hawkeye and Thor kissing, which I've seen a lot of, and God bless, absolutely, it's lovely. But at a certain point, I can only take so much of that. But it wasn't. It was incredibly diverse. You've got memoir work from all different kinds of people, and it was just an incredibly vast array of work, and it was a good selling convention too, which is nice as a cartoonist, because people were there to support the artists who were really hungry for all this material. It was really, really fun. So I highly recommend FlameCon as well. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Have you ever, in filming with have you ever encountered anybody who showed apprehension at having their work displayed or recorded?
Yeah.
And if so, how would you go about that?
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting. I mean, there are a lot of very fragile cartoonists, and there is a kind of I ran into it more with the book, right? So for sure, there's one cartoonist whose work is incredible and really important, but he's kind of gone off the rails, and he lives in a cabin somewhere, and no internet access, and you've got to talk to his friend who will send him a letter. You have to send a snail mail letter to the friend, and he's very suspicious about everything, right? So there's that kind of stuff. That's only one person, but I had to really struggle to get him into the book. With the film, we can only showcase about 5 cartoonists really, in order to kind of keep a sense of a character arc and kind of engagement emotionally with the characters. What I'm realizing in the difference between the film and the book is that the book can be an overview of this material and and I have an essay in the beginning to put it in a historical and cultural context, but the film can't really do that, right? You have to create emotional engagement with these characters, and they have to be characters, and they have to have a character arc. So you can only do that with a few people. So we have those people. So I knew already, the people who weren't going to deal with being filmed, I wasn't going to talk. I was gonna try. We also have a kind of Greek chorus of different younger creators talking about their perspectives, and that kind of gives some context to stuff. but yeah, it was pre-selected in that sense. So, any other thoughts? All right, I was going to just transition to some of my own work right now. I'm working on a graphic novel called Castle and Creek, which is set in the National Guard Armory building at 14th and Mission in San Francisco. Do people know that building? It's amazing. It's so amazing. So it was bought by Kink.com, a streaming internet porn company. They had it for 10 years. They actually just sold it, which breaks my heart, to some like douchey I went for the second to last day, and they were like, no, there's nothing left. Oh. Yeah. All right. I want to pick your brains about what you found later. But I used to do porn as well, and I did a shoot there with Kink, and I became obsessed with the building. And so there's a creek, Mission Creek, that runs from Bernal Heights all the way down through the Mission down to Mission Bay, and it's been paved over the entire way, except in the basement of the Armory building, where it still runs free, which is crazy, right? So I had this whole idea that like if someone dies in the creek, they become a ghost. So there's this ghost haunting the Armory, who's the ghost of a guy, a closeted gay man, one of the guardsmen in the 1930s, who died during the time of the labor unrest, the Bloody Thursday that happens in 1934. And then, so there's a younger guy who comes up to do porn for the first time. He meets a grizzled old porn veteran they get into this daddy-boy relationship. But of course, his ghost is literally kind of haunting their relationship, kind of inhabiting them at different times. So I created the meta-narrative of the guy who dies in the creek is in the 1930s. So I had to do the research of what did 1930s San Francisco look like and how to draw that. The unique problem with comics is that if you're writing historical fiction, if you don't want to describe something, you don't have to describe something. If you don't want to describe, you don't want to find out what the buttons look like on the shirt, you just don't write about it. But if you're drawing it, you got to know what the buttons look like. So doing historically accurate comics are just really, really difficult. And I'm also kind of not, I'm definitely not a very organized person. So, I mean, it's kind of, I feel like a lot of what I'm going to say in terms of research is more like do what I say, not as I do. But I definitely, there are ways to dive deeply into this material, find a lot of source photographs, photographic evidence of different clothing and architectural styles and furniture and all the stuff that you need to make work. Or you can be a little sloppier and just do a lot of Google image searches, which is kind of more what I did. And also find other comics that are based in the 1930s. Luckily, there's a comic called Sandman Mystery Theater, which is set in 1930s in New York. And I was able to kind of swipe a bunch of, at least the costumery and stuff from Guy Davis. But it's interesting, like trying to figure out, okay, what was, what would San Francisco have been like? And certainly the Armory itself. So I went to the Armory, I have friends who work there, and so I was able to kind of do a lot of photo references of the building, and then also figure out at what point, because there was, for example, there's this huge drill court, this massive drill court. Have people been inside? I mean, no, you have, but yeah. I mean, that drill court's amazing, right? And it has like echoes to it. It's incredible. But it was actually uncovered until 1938, I believe. So my earlier story of this closeted gay man was actually done in 1934, so it would have been open, right? So I had to find archival photographs of the Armory during that time period to see what it looked like when it was uncovered. So there are things like that where you have to kind of figure out what things look like. Now also a lot more building has been done within the drill court. I'll show you some images. The other meta-narrative that I had to deal with was I'm obsessed with the Golden Age Wonder Woman because it's amazing. Not to go down a total rabbit hole here, but the creator of Wonder Woman was this remarkable character. You know what I'm talking about. This remarkable character, psychoanalyst, who created the lie detector test and was involved in a triad relationship with two women. And and one of the women, who was the girlfriend of the married couple, she was actually the niece of Margaret Sanger, the pioneering first-wave feminist who created the birth control pill and Planned Parenthood. So there's a lot there, right? So Wonder Woman is deeply, like, I think it's one of the most radical things ever published in America, and it was a kids' comics in the 1940s. I mean, really incredible. So I'm obsessed with this stuff. So I have, in my book, I have Wonder Woman, have a parody of the Golden Age Wonder Woman that's created by a lesbian underground cartoonist in the 1970s, and she's vanished, and this is kind of based on me trying to look for that woman, Natalie, who had become a nurse. So later on, she winds up showing up in the story. She's the hospice nurse for one of the characters. And then they're finally able to find the last issue of the storyline, right? So I then have pages from this parody of the Golden Age Wonder Woman laced throughout the graphic novel. So I had to figure out a way to create a style that was a parody of a 1940s comic done by a 70s underground cartoonist. Here's an example of this is a 2 pages from a Wonder Woman archive editions that DC Comics published in 2002. And what they did was they they recolored everything, right? So you don't get the dots, right? In the past, all colors were done with these little dots, zipatone dots, halftone dots, and they flat colored everything and recolored everything. But you do get a sense of the kind of crazy color scheme here, right? These bright yellow. This is a boxing rink, and there's bright yellow for here, and just kind of weird. I mean, this building has a light blue and then a bright yellow and then a green for the floor. I mean, it just makes no sense, but it's very Golden Age, very weird. So here's 2 of my panels that were kind of done an homage to that scene, right? So because the National Guard Armory building for a while was actually a boxing rink. It became known as kind of Madison Square West, basically, for a couple of decades after the National Guard had moved out. So I have a whole boxing sequence. And Steve Trevor is Wonder Woman's boyfriend. In my parody, Wonder Woman goes back to Paradise Island. Steve Trevor becomes the power stud that he was always meant to be. And and Etta Candy, who's Wonder Woman's gal pal, becomes the Dom Dyke that she was always meant to be as well. So it all works out for everybody. Here's an example of the Golden Age Wonder Woman, and this is colored originally. Unfortunately, the quality here is not so great, because you can't really see, but there's a kind of yellowish color here, and the halftone dots. And so what I'm going to be doing is going back through and finding original, or actually comics from the 70s, getting that yellowish color, scanning that, and then recreating that as a page backdrop, right, for every one of my pages. And then going through and creating halftone dot versions of all the color plates. Which not really looking forward to that whole part of it. But also just to show you how one of the examples of how bizarre the Golden Age Wonder Woman was. Steve Trevor gets a magic orb that makes him stronger than Wonder Woman. And he starts getting all kind of freaky. And Great Hera, you are stronger than I am, Steve. Whenever I ask you to marry me, you always brush me off. This time I make you listen. By the way, whenever Steve Trevor would ask Wonder Woman to marry him, she had the best blow-off line ever. She would say, "I would love to marry you. We're madly in love, just as soon as there's no more crime and injustice in the world. Just as soon as I've done my job and there's no more crime and injustice in the world, we'll get married." It's just like, oh, that's perfect. So here he's like, I'm going to make you listen. So this is what it feels like to be bossed by a strong man. Some girls love to have a man stronger than they are and make them do things. Do I like it? I don't know. It's sort of thrilling, but isn't it more fun to make the man obey? Yeah, and at the end of this comic, Steve Trevor realizes that he's just a jerk, and he can't handle this kind of power, so he smashes the orb and goes back to being her sub, which is really what he's supposed to be. It's an amazing, and if you don't think there aren't homoerotic elements to this material as well, this is one. These the Amazons play this game where half of them dress up as deer, and they run through the woods, and the other half hunt the deer, and then with suction cup arrows. and then collect them for the chef, who will then skin them and bake them into a pie that they present to the queen, and then they have to dance for the queen. And it's, I mean, you think puppies, like the whole kind of pup thing, like you think that's, whenever I, you know, see guys who are so excited about the pup thing, I'm like, Wonder Woman was doing this back in the 40s. But this is a lovely piece. You'll make a lovely chicken, darling. Wait until I give you a crisp skin. You make my mouth water. How about feeding me to myself? 1941, kids comic. Amazing. So this is how I tried to get a sense of that kind of eroticism and stuff and take it a little bit farther. It's hard to do a parody of something that is so outrageous, and in some ways it was flatter. You know, I have Steve Trevor here become a sub for this dominatrix kind of character and a flogging scene, which Wonder Woman did that as well. So my parody is actually probably less out there than the original, but I did my best. This is a page from the Roland storyline, which is the 1930s closeted gay man living in San Francisco. So, for example, up here you can see a panel where where I really, you know, tried to, I used an image, an older image, adjusted it enough. So one of the things I would definitely say is if you're making comics and you want to use photographic imagery, adjust it. I mean, you usually kind of have to simplify the work to make it read better. But it's also kind of a good thing to do, so you don't run into any copyright problems. So I, adjusted this imagery, brought in cards from other photographs, and I made it work. You can see the clothing and all this. They come into what is the kind of proto-gay bar at the time, kind of bar for sailors. And you can see here, I found imagery from bars from the 30s, and I used that as the basis for those kind of illustrations. You see the old cash register here, for example, and the bartenders would dress in little bow ties and such. So this was also at the tail end of Prohibition, so there's a speakeasy vibe to all this. Here's one of the here's an image of 1930 San Francisco that is one of the photographic references I used for another illustration. So this stuff is available, it's out there. I also took a lot of my own pictures, as I said. So this is the outside of the National Guard Armory building as it is today, and I bleached the color out of it to make it easier to draw. And this is a page, so you can see the top panel is what I pulled, the illustration that I pulled from that. The bottom is an illustration of the interior. By the way, I go into in terms of my process, I'll go in with Photoshop and click this. This will be all black, for example. I'll add color and texture and spot blacks. But you can see here's some images of the inside. It's also nice to work with models, so you can get a sense of perspective, right? So kind of upshots when I'm looking at the ceiling of this cavernous space. But these, this whole kind of structure here is also quite new. So I have to go back and find archival stuff to figure out what that stuff looked like. And I know I want to have a little bit of time for questions on this part of it as well. Here, another whole scene takes place in the Hole in the Wall bar, which is a really kind of famous punk rock bar in San Francisco, an amazing place. And at nighttime, you can't really see much of it. It's all neon lights and weird stuff, right? And you can't go in with a flash because that's really disturbing to the bar patrons. But I'm friends with one of the bartenders and asked him if I could come in, and take photographs before they open. And he said, yeah, come in the morning, tomorrow morning. I was like, what time? 2 p.m. Oh, sorry, bartender morning. But so I came in and I did all the. It's full of art. I mean, this is like all the walls are kind of coming alive with crazy amounts of art, which I can't possibly show all of that kind of detail. Here's the illustration I did from that. This will be spot black. I'll click black into that, but you get a sense of, I have to start kind of creating abstractions of all the details because there's just too much of it. But at least you get a sense of it. Also, you can kind of cheat on perspective, which is really nice. Here's an example of it with the lights off. So you can see all the crazy neons, which I'll have to try to replicate some of that stuff with the coloring. And then this is what it's like with the light on. Skeleton riding a Harley, like they do. Yeah, so any questions on the comics process? I know some of you are actually making comics. Yeah, it's interesting, like, with smaller work, I like it, kind of. Like, I mean, I like the fact that it's underground, and I'm kind of like, got my people that I can sell to, and they get excited by it, and it's that supportive community thing, the insular community. And not just queers, but, as queer allies and all that. But it is more nerve-wracking with a big book like this. It's gonna take me, I've already put a couple years into it. It's gonna take me probably 2 more years. And I know that, yeah, it's really weird and really queer, and my only hope is that if it belly flops, it's a spectacular, splashy belly flop, So yeah, I'm quite aware that it's probably not, a big book publisher probably won't approach it. However, I think the world has changed enough now that, you had Emma Ferris just did this massive graphic novel called My Favorite Thing is Monsters. It's a lesbian book, and it's incredibly bizarre, and it really hit, New York Times bestseller. It was reviewed by the New York Times, and it was published by Fantagraphics, which is the publisher for No Straight Lines. I don't think it wouldn't have been published maybe by a book publisher, but now she's broken, every year you get another book to kind of push it farther, right? And so, yeah, I mean, maybe by the time this is, done, maybe a big book publisher will, hand me a big advance for a really weird, really queer, porn, set in the porn industry, bizarre San Francisco tale, but we'll see. If not, I mean, what? I'm not doing this for the money, but I would like people to read it. Like, that is important to me. Yeah, no, and webcomics have changed everything, right? I mean, the internet has transformed, obviously, kind of everything across the board, but I mean, certainly in terms of distribution of comics material, and especially stuff that's really niche, like queer comics, absolutely has opened up new possibilities. And again, because there's more acceptance of different kinds of narratives, you'll have, everybody's trying to figure out what's going to be the kind of what's going to plateau is the big platforms for webcomics, and that's still kind of up in the air to a certain extent. But all of those platforms that are around, around now, like Tapas, they absolutely are open to queer content. I mean, absolutely. A lot of them are very international focused as well, and there's been always been a tremendous amount of queer material since the early 70s in Japan. There's a lot of caveats to that. Yaoi, Shonenai, BL. That's a whole other discussion, but there is queer content is not necessarily scary for a lot of these new digital distributions, and that's really hopeful. And also just Tumblr, just doing it yourself, right? I mean, if people create communities and kind of repost things, and it's really quite amazing. So it's a hopeful time right now.